Year was 1788. The winds over Paris carried a weight heavier than rain. Whispers of change, of struggle, of something brewing just beneath the surface. France, once the symbol of elegance and grandeur, had grown tired. Its people were burdened under the weight of rising costs, endless taxes, and hollow promises. At the heart of this crumbling world stood a palace, Versailles, glittering with chandeliers and golden mirrors, but blind to the hunger outside its gates. The monarchy, led by King Louis XVI, believed itself untouchable. The king, a man of quiet manners and indecision, ruled from behind walls that stretched higher than the cries of the working class. His queen, Marie Antoinette, born of Austrian royalty, became a symbol of extravagance in a time of scarcity. Her rumored words, "Let them eat cake," though likely never spoken, became the battle cry of resentment. But the people of France were not just starving for bread. They were starving for dignity. The country's finances were in ruin. Decades of wars, including one that helped birth a new country across the ocean, had drained the treasury. The nobles and clergy, however, were largely exempt from taxation. It was the commoners, the Third Estate, who carried the weight of the realm. Farmers, merchants, craftsmen, teachers, together they made up nearly all of France, yet had little to no voice in how it was governed. In May of 1789, in a grand hall at Versailles, representatives from all three estates gathered for a meeting, the Estates General. It had been called for the first time in over 170 years. The king hoped to raise new taxes, but the Third Estate had other plans. Their leader, a modest lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, stood with calm conviction. He spoke of rights, of freedom, of equality. His words did not shout, they echoed. They stirred something in the room, something ancient and powerful, the desire to be heard. Tensions quickly rose. The Third Estate, frustrated by the lack of progress and the unequal voting system, broke away and formed their own assembly. They called it the National Assembly. The king tried to lock them out of their meeting hall, so they gathered in a nearby tennis court. There they swore an oath. They would not disband until France had a new constitution. It was called the Tennis Court Oath, and it became the first true act of defiance against centuries of tradition. It was not a rebellion yet, but it was no longer just a whisper. It was a spark. Outside Versailles, the streets of Paris were heating up. Food was scarce, prices were soaring. Armed troops moved closer to the capital, making the citizens uneasy. Rumors flew. Was the king planning to crush the assembly? Would he dissolve it by force? Then came the dismissal of Jacques Necker, the king's finance minister. He was one of the few in government the people actually trusted. When he was removed, it was seen as a declaration, not of reform, but of resistance. Crowds began to form in the city. At first they were looking for news, then for weapons. The storm had begun. Paris, July 14th, 1789. The morning sun rose over a city on edge. Rumors of soldiers marching toward the capital had turned fear into action. The people of Paris, shopkeepers, laborers, apprentices, took to the streets, not with banners but with urgency. They needed arms. They needed powder. They first seized the Hôtel des Invalides, an old veterans' hospital holding thousands of muskets. But the powder, the fire behind the weapon, was stored elsewhere, inside a fortress that had loomed over Paris for centuries. A prison, a symbol, the Bastille. It was not the size of the crowd that made the day unforgettable. It was the sound. The roar of voices, the crack of gunfire, the boom of cannons dragged through the streets by hand. The Bastille was guarded by fewer than 100 men, some soldiers, some retired guards. Inside, only 7 prisoners remained, but the prison itself was not the goal. It was what it represented. To the people, the Bastille was not just a building. It was a monument to royal power, a place where individuals had been held without trial for centuries. When the gates were not opened, the crowd surged. Negotiations failed. Shots rang out. The fight lasted for hours. By evening, the Bastille had fallen. Its commander, Governor Delaunay, was captured and brought before the crowd. What followed was chaotic and raw. His fate became the signal that the old order was no longer safe. The fall of the Bastille was not just a battle, it was a message that the people could rise, that stone walls and iron gates were no longer enough to protect a system built on silence and control. News of the victory spread like fire across France. Villagers and townsfolk, inspired by what Paris had done, began to rise. They attacked manors, burned documents of feudal dues, and took control of local governments. This movement became known as the Great Fear, a wave of revolt driven by both desperation and hope. Back in Versailles, the king received the news. "Is it a revolt?" he asked. "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution." The National Assembly began moving swiftly. Feudal rights were abolished. The privileges of the nobility began to crumble. By late August, the Assembly released a declaration, one that would shape history far beyond the borders of France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It declared that all men were born free and equal. That sovereignty belonged not to a monarch, but to the people. It spoke of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The language was clear, the tone fearless. But words alone were not enough. Outside the cities, famine still bit at the edges of daily life. Bread was scarce. Trust in the king was fading. In October of 1789, thousands of women from Paris, many of them mothers and workers, marched to Versailles. Their message was not crafted in halls of debate. It came from hunger and heartache. They demanded food. They demanded the king return to Paris. By the end of the march, they got both. Louis XVI and his family were escorted back to the capital under the watch of a people no longer willing to be ruled from afar. The Palace of Versailles was left behind. The center of power had shifted. The revolution was no longer a dream, it was reality. 1790 turned to 1791. The old world had cracked, but it had not yet shattered. France was changing, yet deeply uncertain. The National Assembly had stripped away many of the nobles' privileges. The church, too, was brought under state control. Lands were seized. Clergy were required to swear loyalty to the nation, not just their faith. Some complied, others refused. A divide was forming, not only in society, but within hearts and families. Meanwhile, King Louis XVI watched from the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Surrounded by guards, his royal title remained, but his power had shrunk. Still, he hoped that outside France, allies remained, that the old monarchies of Europe would not let a king fall without protest. In June of 1791, he made his move. Late at night, the royal family fled Paris in disguise, hidden in a simple carriage. Their destination, the fortress town of Montmedy, near the Austrian border. There, loyal troops waited. From there, perhaps, the old order could be restored. But fate had other plans. At a small town called Varennes, the king was recognized. A postmaster spotted him, his face still printed on coins. The royal family was stopped, escorted back to Paris under heavy guard. The escape attempt broke what trust remained. To many, the king was no longer a reluctant partner in reform. He was an opponent, a symbol of resistance to the will of the people. The revolution pushed forward. In 1792, tensions with other European powers exploded. Austria and Prussia, both uneasy with France's upheaval, began to prepare for war. Revolutionaries feared invasion. Royalists hoped for it. France declared war. Volunteers flooded Paris. Drums echoed through the streets. Songs were born in the fire of this moment, most famously La Marseillaise, which would one day become the national anthem. But fear ruled the city. Rumors spread of foreign troops approaching, of traitors inside the walls. The prisons overflowed with suspects, nobles, clergy, anyone suspected of disloyalty. In September, panic erupted into violence. Over several days, prisoners were taken from their cells and attacked. The city turned inward on itself. These events, later known as the September Days, left a scar on the revolution's image even among its strongest supporters. Despite the chaos, the National Convention was formed, replacing the earlier assembly. Its first act was clear and bold. France was no longer a monarchy. The Republic had begun. The king, once shielded by titles and tradition, was now simply citizen Louis Capet. His fate was placed in the hands of the convention. Debates raged. Some called for mercy, others demanded justice. In January 1793, the decision was made. Louis was found guilty of actions against the nation. He was taken to a square in Paris where a new invention, designed for efficiency and equality, stood ready. The moment was quiet. Then the blade fell. France had crossed a line. The revolution had claimed its first monarch. Across Europe, shock turned to resolve. The great powers formed alliances. Armies marched. Inside France, tension turned to survival. And in the streets of Paris, one phrase echoed louder than all others: liberty, equality, fraternity. But as the war dragged on and enemies circled, a new question arose. How far would the Republic go to protect its ideals? The Republic was born in fire, and now it faced the storm. France was at war on all sides: Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain. Internal uprisings ignited in the countryside. Royalists and rebels rose in defiance. Starvation stalked the cities. Fear became a constant companion. To protect the revolution, the convention turned to one of its most passionate voices, Maximilien Robespierre. A lawyer with a sharp mind and firm ideals, he believed in virtue, in justice, and above all, in the will of the people. But in times of crisis, even noble beliefs can take a darker shape. The Committee of Public Safety was formed, with Robespierre at its center. Its mission was to defend the Republic from enemies, foreign and domestic. Laws were passed with speed. Trials were swift. Punishments, absolute. This period would become known as the Reign of the People, or, as some would later call it, the Reign of Fear. In the name of protecting freedom, thousands were condemned. Nobles, clergy, former allies, even revolutionaries themselves. No one was beyond suspicion. Words alone could be taken as betrayal. Loyalty was demanded, and questioning became dangerous. Marie Antoinette, once Queen of France, was brought before the tribunal. The crowd watched in silence as she was taken through the streets of Paris. Days later, her fate mirrored her husband's. Across the nation, guillotines were raised in town squares, symbols of justice, but also of fear. A powerful message. The revolution did not hesitate. Yet even as the trials continued, the government pressed on with reforms. Slavery was abolished in the French colonies. Education was promoted. A new calendar was introduced, erasing the old symbols of monarchy and religion. The revolution was reshaping not just politics, but time, thought, and society itself. Still, many began to question, had the revolution gone too far? Even among Robespierre's allies, trust wavered. He had become more isolated, more guarded. He believed deeply in virtue, but now he defined it alone. In July of 1794, the convention turned on him. Arrested, wounded, and silenced, Robespierre was taken to the very place where he had sent so many. The square was quiet, then the blade fell once more. The reign of the people ended as suddenly as it began. In the months that followed, France stepped away from the extremes. The convention reformed. The executions stopped. A new government, known as the Directory, was formed. It was cautious, moderate, and fragile. The revolution had torn down kings and built new hopes, but the road ahead was still uncertain. And far from the chaos of Paris, a young general was rising through the ranks. His name, Napoleon Bonaparte. He would soon step forward to lead a wounded nation and forever change the face of Europe. The French Revolution was not a single event, but a wave that reshaped a world. It began with hunger and voices demanding fairness. It became a movement of hope, of courage, of pain. And though it cost much, it left behind an idea that power belongs not by birthright, but by the people's will. Its echoes can still be heard today, in the streets where people march, in the words written into law, And in every moment when individuals rise and say, "We are the people, we will be heard,"